All right, it's recording. Okay, hey guys. Um, all right, so let's talk about rhetoric. Um, I find that the best way to really get into rhetoric is to be very clear about terminology from the beginning. So before we start applying or analyzing or doing any of those things, I want you to know your terms very well. So what I've created for you and what you should have already looked at is this rhetorical terms sheet here. And I want you to take notes here. Type your notes up as you're watching this video, as you're reading through your textbook, as you're looking through watching the other videos and looking through the other materials that are part of this module. And save this document. Hang on to it. Hang on to these notes. I will be asking you to submit it later in Unit 2, but also just save it as a reference. We will be coming back to these terms over and over and over again throughout the semester. So hang on to this sheet. This video here, right now, all we're going to talk about is that very first term there, rhetoric. All right, we're going to talk about some definitions of rhetoric, what it is. Make sure you have a good understanding here. So this is the definition that your book gives. The wide array of communicative devices humans have at their disposal to create effects on each other. Okay, great. That's fine. That's fine. But what does it actually mean? What does that definition actually mean? What do they mean by communicative devices? What do they mean by creating effects on each other? I'm going to give you a different definition, one that I think, well, it at least makes more sense to me personally. So this is the definition I like to go with rhetoric. Rhetoric is communication with a purpose, with intention, with design, with however you want to think about it. So it's writing, speech, or any other media, really any other media that is meant to persuade or connect with an audience. Just lost my light. Hang on. Turn on, turn on. Okay, there we go. So what does that mean? Communication with purpose, writing, speech, other media. I want to pause on this word persuade here because another definition of rhetoric that's sometimes thrown out that maybe you've heard before is that rhetoric is the art of persuasion. And rhetoric is maybe easiest to approach from the idea of persuasion because it's very obvious that way. And in Unit 2, we will very much be talking about the persuasive side of rhetoric when we'll be focusing on the rhetoric of ads. And ads are very persuasive. They're trying to persuade you to buy a product. But rhetoric is not just about persuasion. I don't want you to forget about this second half of this definition, connecting with an audience. Rhetoric really is simply about communicating. How we manage to communicate, get a point across to an audience. That is really what we mean when we say rhetoric, how we manage to communicate. So what I want to talk about for the rest of this video is what counts as a rhetorical text. Use the word text or maybe object. What kinds of things are rhetorical? So under this definition, there's a pretty wide array of things that might count as rhetorical. So I've already talked about ads as being rhetorical, right? Here's an ad. It's trying to communicate something, it's trying to get a message across, it's trying to persuade, okay? Persuade you to drink Coke, right? Now we could analyze this deeper, but we don't have the terminology for that yet, so we'll maybe come back to that. But let's think about what other types of objects might count as rhetorical. What about a novel? War and Peace. Would a novel count as rhetorical? What about a poem? What about someone giving a speech? Well, you probably guessed, but yes, all these things are rhetorical. Um, they are all acts of writing or speaking or dealing with language in some way. And yes, they're all trying to communicate something, connect with an audience in some way. They're meant to be read, they're meant to be heard by an audience. That makes them rhetorical. Okay? Um, Here's maybe a tricky one to think about though. What about a diary? Um, is a private journal or a private diary trying to communicate something? Is there an audience? Um, is it rhetorical then? What do you think? I'm not going to answer this. I'll ask for your opinion right after this video is over in a short writing. You can tell me, but think about it. Under that definition I gave you earlier, would a diary count as being a rhetorical text? Now, rhetorical objects are not just written things, right? Pictures can be rhetorical too. Images can be rhetorical too, right? Take a look at this image. Um, is it trying to communicate something? Is there a story going on here? Do we look at this image and know something, right? Is it communicating something to us? There's a little story going on here, right? But it can get trickier. What about this image? Would this image count as rhetorical? That is something being communicated here? So I'll go ahead and answer this one. It might be a little bit harder to see, but the answer, in my opinion at least, is yes, right? That there is still an attempt being made to connect with the viewer of this painting, that something is trying to be communicated. Now, it might be very subtle, it might be hard to pick out what it is, but I'm going to make the argument that yes, this type of image is rhetorical. What about these ones? Okay, we got a bunch of different things going on here, right? Are these objects rhetorical? Do they communicate in some way? Um, think about how anything, really, anything might be communicating something. So here's an exercise, a way to think about this. Imagine that you've just walked into a room for the very first time. You've never been in that room before, but you immediately see that there is a chalkboard on one wall and that there's rows of desks and chairs. What has this room automatically communicated to you? Well, it's communicated just by the way it's set up, by the way it looks, by the way the objects that are in it, that it's a classroom. You all of a sudden know that. This is a classroom. So that space has communicated with you. Objects send messages. Spaces send messages. They reveal things about themselves, about the way they're meant to be used. They reveal things like status or all sorts of messages. All sorts of messages can be sent by almost anything. And that makes them rhetorical, right? The fact that they're trying to communicate, they're trying to influence us. And it's our job, at least in this class, to figure out what we can learn by looking at these objects as being rhetorical. Become aware of how all of these things are communicating to us, how they're trying to influence us, and what strategies they're using to do that. But our very first objective here in this first unit is to understand how you, as a person, are already a rhetorical text. You are constantly communicating with purpose, constantly trying to get various audiences to understand and connect with you, persuade others to believe things about you. So that's what our very first assignment is about, starting with you and looking at the ways you already use rhetoric. How do you present yourself to the world around you? How do you connect with the various audiences watching you? To really answer that question well, we need a few more rhetorical tools under our belt, a few more rhetorical terms. So let's get on to our next term or set of terms. We'll be talking about the rhetorical situation.